Imagine the scenario. It's 3 a.m. in Tehran. Iranian military radars suddenly detect unusual movements in the Persian Gulf. American bombers are reportedly taking off. Submarines are quietly changing position. And inside several strategic bases across the Middle East, the U.S. military is moving to maximum alert. Then, a few minutes later, Donald Trump appears in front of the cameras, and he delivers a sentence that immediately sends chills through markets, diplomats, and military headquarters. Iran won't even see what's coming. From that moment, one question becomes central. If Trump truly decided to strike Iran, what exactly would he try to destroy first in order to bring the regime to its knees in less than 48 hours? Because contrary to what many people imagine, modern warfare is no longer just about bombing cities or sending troops on the ground. Today, a superpower first tries to hit the vital points, the nerve centers, the infrastructures that allow a state to communicate, retaliate, and survive militarily. And in Iran's case, the Americans already know almost everything. Sensitive bases, nuclear facilities, missile depots, command centers, radar systems, underground networks. For years, American satellites, drones, intelligence agencies, and cyber units have been carefully mapping Iran's military capabilities. In other words, if an attack started tomorrow, the targets would probably already have been selected long ago. And what worries military experts the most is the potential speed of such an operation. Because the United States would probably not seek a long war. The objective would instead be to create a massive shock within the first hours. Blind Iran, disorganize its military, cut its communication capabilities, neutralize its missiles before they can even be launched. And above all, prevent Tehran from coordinating a regional response. Because the real danger for Washington doesn't come only from Iran's conventional army. The danger comes from the entire network Iran has built across the Middle East over the years. Allied militias, armed groups, drones, missiles spread across several countries. And that's exactly what makes this scenario extremely explosive. Because an American strike against Iran would probably not remain limited to Iran itself. Israel could immediately become a target. American bases in the Gulf could also be attacked. Global maritime traffic could be disrupted. Oil prices could skyrocket within hours. And that's why Trump's statements generate so much tension every single time. Because behind the dramatic rhetoric lies a very concrete reality. The United States already possesses the military capabilities needed to strike Iran extremely quickly. Stealth bombers, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, cruise missiles, cyber attacks, surveillance drones, all of this can be mobilized in a very short time. But then, what would the first real targets actually be? Which sites would Washington absolutely try to destroy during the opening hours? And above all, why are some Iranian installations considered so strategic that they could determine the outcome of an entire war? That's exactly what we're about to see now. If Donald Trump decided to launch a massive military operation against Iran, then the absolute priority would almost certainly remain the same from the very first minutes: Iran's nuclear program. Why? Because for Washington, the real strategic tipping point lies there. For years, the United States, Israel, and several Western countries have accused Iran of moving dangerously close to the nuclear threshold. Officially, Tehran insists that its program is civilian, but behind the scenes, concerns continue to grow. Because enriching uranium to very high levels mechanically brings a country closer to the ability to build a nuclear weapon. And for the Americans, there is one absolute red line: preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear military power. That's why certain facilities would likely be targeted immediately. The first name that always comes up is Natanz. Natanz is essentially the technological heart of Iran's nuclear program, a massive, highly protected complex housing centrifuges capable of enriching uranium. And the key word here is protected, because Iran fully understands that this site has been a primary target for years. As a result, part of the facility has been buried deep underground to withstand conventional airstrikes. In other words, a standard missile would probably not be enough. The United States would likely need to use very specific weapons, massive bunker-buster bombs capable of penetrating deep layers of rock and concrete before exploding. And that's where things move into an entirely different military dimension, because these weapons are not used to send a warning. They are used to permanently destroy strategic infrastructure. But Natanz would probably be only part of the problem. There is also Fordow, and Fordow worries some military experts even more. Why? Because the site was literally built inside a mountain. The goal was simple: make destruction extremely difficult, even for the United States. And it is precisely this type of installation that could push Washington to deploy its heaviest capabilities. B-2 stealth bombers, ultra-penetrating munitions, highly coordinated precision strikes. Because if the United States strikes, it will want to avoid a worst-case scenario, damaging the facilities without truly neutralizing them. Because in that case, Iran could rebuild quickly and resume its nuclear activities even more discreetly. But there is another aspect people often forget. These nuclear sites are not just technical infrastructures. They are also massive political symbols for the Iranian regime. The nuclear program represents power, sovereignty, and resistance against Western pressure. So striking these facilities would also send an extremely powerful psychological message. The United States can reach the very core of Iran's strategic ambitions. And that's where tensions become critical, because an attack of this scale would almost never remain unanswered. For Tehran, it would likely be viewed as a major humiliation. And the larger the strike, the greater the pressure to retaliate, especially since Iran possesses several indirect means of response: ballistic missiles, drones, cyber attacks, regional allied groups. In other words, destroying the nuclear sites could happen quickly, but preventing escalation afterward would be another story entirely. And precisely to avoid an immediate retaliation, the United States would also need to target another essential pillar of Iranian power: military bases and missile systems. But even if the United States succeeded in striking Iran's nuclear facilities, the danger would not disappear. Because Iran's real threat today does not rely only on nuclear ambitions. It relies heavily on missiles. And that is exactly what completely changes the American military calculation. For years, Iran has built one of the largest ballistic missile arsenals in the Middle East. Hundreds, possibly thousands of missiles with different ranges, some capable of reaching Israel, others capable of striking American bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Iraq, or the United Arab Emirates. And most importantly, some of these missiles are mobile. That's the real problem. Unlike fixed bases that can be located easily, some Iranian launchers can move rapidly and hide inside tunnels, mountains, or desert areas. In other words, the moment a conflict begins, a race against time would start. The United States would need to strike before those missiles are launched. And this is likely where the most massive phase of the operation would begin. Dozens of simultaneous strikes, possibly hundreds. The objective? Cripple Iran's retaliatory capabilities before they fully activate. The first targets would probably include missile silos, weapons depots, military command centers, radar systems, air defense batteries, secure communication centers. Because in modern warfare, whoever controls the skies controls almost everything. And the United States would immediately seek total air superiority. What does that mean in practice? It means preventing Iran from properly detecting American aircraft, preventing its defense systems from functioning effectively, cutting communication between military units, creating confusion, disorganizing the chain of command. And to achieve that, Washington possesses an extremely powerful technological combination. First, B-2 stealth bombers, aircraft specifically designed to penetrate heavily defended airspace without being easily detected. Then come Tomahawk missiles, cruise missiles capable of being launched from submarines or destroyers hundreds of kilometers away. Then surveillance drones, military satellites, radar aircraft, electronic warfare systems, cyber attacks. Because today, war is no longer fought only with explosions. It is also fought inside computer networks. And the United States could attempt to disable certain Iranian infrastructures even before launching physical strikes. Radar systems jammed, communications disrupted, control centers hacked. The objective would be simple: blind Iran. Because a country that can no longer clearly see what is happening becomes far more vulnerable. But despite American military power, there is a major risk. Iran understands that it would struggle to compete directly against the United States. So for years, its strategy has focused on preparing an asymmetric response. In other words, strike differently. Not necessarily with modern aircraft or a conventional military force of equal strength, but through dispersed, rapid attacks that are difficult to fully stop. Missiles launched from multiple locations, explosive drones, maritime attacks, cyber attacks, and above all, Iran could try to overwhelm American and Israeli defenses. Because even the world's most advanced missile defense systems have limits when faced with massive waves of projectiles. And this is precisely the scenario that deeply worries Western strategists, because a lightning war supposedly lasting 48 hours could quickly evolve into a much larger and uncontrollable regional conflict, especially if Iran decides to use its most dangerous geographic weapon, the Strait of Hormuz. But the real danger, the one that genuinely terrifies world powers, could begin after the American strikes. Because Iran possesses a weapon that many countries fear more than a conventional military attack. That weapon is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime passage on the map, but in reality, one of the most strategic choke points on the entire planet. Why? Because an enormous share of the world's oil supply passes through this route. Every day, dozens of giant oil tankers cross this narrow corridor located between Iran and the Gulf monarchies. In other words, if this route is disrupted, the entire global economy could be shaken, and Iran knows that perfectly well. For years, Tehran has prepared scenarios capable of turning this strait into a major crisis zone within just a few hours. Naval mines, coastal missiles, explosive drones, armed fast boats, attacks on commercial vessels. The objective would not even necessarily be to fully block the strait. Creating fear alone could be enough. Because the moment maritime insurers panic, the moment oil companies fear for their ships, the economic consequences become immediate. Oil prices could explode overnight, financial markets could crash, shipping costs could surge, and at that point, the conflict would instantly move beyond the military sphere. It would become global. Because a massive oil shock would affect almost every country. More expensive fuel, inflation, higher energy costs, economic pressure on populations. And that is exactly why every tension between Washington and Tehran is watched so closely by international markets. But the Strait of Hormuz is probably only part of the problem, because Iran also possesses another extremely dangerous lever: its regional network. For years, Tehran has developed alliances and armed groups across several Middle Eastern countries. And in a direct confrontation with the United States, these groups could enter the conflict almost immediately. In Lebanon, Hezbollah possesses a massive arsenal of rockets and missiles. In Iraq, several pro-Iranian militias could target American bases. In Yemen, the Houthis have already demonstrated their ability to disrupt maritime traffic using drones and missiles. In other words, a strike against Iran could trigger multiple fronts simultaneously. And this is exactly what American strategists fear, because at first, the objective might simply be a rapid and targeted operation. But once the machine starts moving, controlling escalation becomes far more difficult, especially since Israel would immediately become part of the equation. Because if Iran or its allies decided to target Israeli territory, then the retaliation could become even more massive. And at that point, the entire Middle East could slide into a major regional confrontation. The most alarming part is that this scenario is no longer purely theoretical. Over the past years, multiple incidents have already shown how quickly the region can ignite. Tanker attacks, drone strikes, missile launches, cyber attacks, sabotage operations. Every crisis pushes the Middle East a little closer to a breaking point. And that's why Donald Trump's words are taken so seriously. Because behind the dramatic statements lies a very concrete military reality. The plans already exist. The targets are known. The capabilities are already deployed. But nobody can guarantee what would happen after the first strike. And that is precisely what makes this threat so dangerous for global stability. Ultimately, the most alarming question in this entire story may not even be whether the United States can strike Iran, because everybody already knows the answer to that. Yes, militarily, Washington possesses overwhelming superiority. Nuclear aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, submarines capable of launching cruise missiles from hundreds of kilometers away, military satellites, cyber capabilities, global intelligence networks. Within just a few hours, the United States could probably inflict severe damage on large parts of Iran's strategic infrastructure. But the real problem begins immediately afterward, because a war against Iran would probably not resemble the conventional wars of the past. It would not simply be about territory or conquest. It would be a war of regional destabilization, a conflict capable of triggering consequences far beyond the Middle East. And that is exactly what deeply concerns world powers today. Because even if Washington quickly won the initial military phase, nobody truly knows how Iran would respond over time. The Iranian regime has spent years preparing asymmetric resistance strategies. In simple terms, making the cost of war extremely high for its enemies. Not necessarily by militarily defeating the United States, but by creating long-term regional chaos, indirect attacks, cyber attacks against sensitive infrastructure, pressure on maritime trade routes, the activation of allied armed groups across the region, and above all, permanent instability capable of exhausting opponents economically and politically. That is exactly why many experts consider Iran an exceptionally difficult adversary to fully neutralize. Because this is not just a conventional military force, it is an entire regional system. And the longer the conflict lasts, the greater the risk of expansion becomes. Israel could be pulled into a much more direct confrontation. American bases across the Middle East could become constant targets. Maritime traffic could remain disrupted for weeks or even months. And during all of this, the economic consequences would hit the entire world. Higher oil prices, global inflation, financial market instability, economic slowdown. Because today, the global economy remains heavily dependent on energy stability in the Gulf region. But there is another question that many are now beginning to ask. What if such a war permanently changed the global balance of power? Because a major conflict in the Middle East could also push other major powers to react diplomatically, economically, or even militarily. Russia, China, America's regional allies. Everyone would be watching the situation evolve in real time. And in this type of crisis, a single miscalculation can have enormous consequences. A missile incorrectly identified, a strike hitting the wrong target, an attack on a foreign military base, and suddenly, escalation could spiral out of control. That is precisely why Donald Trump's threats generate so much tension every time. Because beyond the political rhetoric, there is an extremely serious reality. The military scenarios already exist. The strike plans have been ready for years. The strategic targets are already known. And the United States genuinely possesses the capabilities to strike very fast and very hard. But in this type of confrontation, the real unknown is never the beginning. The real unknown is what happens afterward. Because a war against Iran might begin within 48 hours, but nobody knows how long it would take to put out the fire once it starts.